Welcome, friends. My name is Nia Thomas, and I serve Quakers in New England as New England Yearly Meetings Quaker Practice and Leadership Facilitator. I'm so glad that you are here and that you're joining us for a conversation that is near and dear to my heart, grace and generational transition. It's so wonderful to see in the chat and in the participants list friends from across New England and well beyond. Welcome. This evening, we will hear from two friends who live and serve with a concern for grace and generational transition, Diane Randall and Nils Klinkenberg. Before Nils introduces himself and then Diane, I want to briefly orient you to how we will be together this evening. I know this topic is alive and tender for many of us. Navigating the generational transitions unfolding in the communities and institutions we love and care about can open us up to our biggest yearnings and invite us into challenges and relationships that stretch us. I invite you this evening to listen to what Diane and Nils offer from a worshipful space, attentive to what's happening in your own heart. I also invite you to share reflections and questions as led. The chat is open. Bobby Trice, who serves as the Quaker Outreach Coordinator for Friends Committee on National Legislation, and Elizabeth Hakala, New England Yearly Meetings Events Coordinator, are here and are serving as tech support this evening. If you need tech support, you can send them a chat message and they will respond as they are able. If you have a question or comment arising from this conversation, you can put it in the public chat for others to see, or you can send it directly to Bobby or Elizabeth. They're going to be compiling the questions and comments that we receive for a facilitated question and response portion at the end of the conversation this evening. And now, let me hand it over to Nils.
Thank you, Nia. And thank you everyone for being here. It's a real an honor and a pleasure to get to be with you all this evening and to have a conversation with Diane and then with all of you about a topic that I care a lot about, as we all do, I think. So briefly, I'll introduce myself. I'll turn it over to Diane, and then Diane, hello. It's great to see you. There are a number of topics that I hope to touch on this evening, but we'll also see where the conversation leads us, where spirit leads us in this conversation, and we'll plan to have some time at the end for Q&A, and folks can write in the chat, and we'll touch on points that come up there as well. So for those who don't know me, my name is Nils Klinkenberg. I have the privilege of serving as the executive director of the Beacon Hill Friends House in downtown Boston, Massachusetts, on the unceded territory of the Massachusetts people. I have been in my role as executive director for about 4.5 years. Before that, I lived in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. And I grew up in New England and very active in the youth programs of New England Yearly Meeting, which I treasured and treasure deeply. And some of my deepest relationships and definitely my grounding in Quakerism was very much in the context of NEYM's youth programs, both as a participant and as a staffer, volunteer staffer for many years. And I grew up attending Framingham Friends Meeting, and now I worship with Beacon Hill Friends. Diane, who are you?
Hi, Nils. It's good to be with you this evening and good to be with all of people on the call tonight. Thanks for joining us. This is, it's just great to sit here and see all these names roll in and realize the expertise, experience, love that so many people who are on this call have for this concern and this issue, and who have taught me I am a convinced friend and a member of Hartford Monthly Meeting, Connecticut Valley Quarter, and New England Yearly Meeting. I have lived in Washington, D.C. for a little over 10 years, moved here to take the position of General Secretary at Friends Committee on National Legislation, and have attended meetings here, but not transferred my membership. Definitely, even though I was not a participant myself in youth programs, my children were, and definitely had an impact on me and my thinking about the Religious Society of Friends. And we'll get into this more, but certainly the work leading a Quaker organization that has really focused on how to try to engage young people in this work has fostered that thinking a lot more. So looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks. And I need to apologize to folks. I'm working my way through a cold I picked up from my 19-month-old son, so I'll try to cough while muted, but my voice may be a slight register deeper than it otherwise would. So to start, I think we can start broad with just some opening questions and see where they lead us. But as I'm sure folks saw, this event was promoted and got the word out through different channels, but this broad topic is grace and generational transition and lifting up leadership. And so maybe Diane, I'll pose a few questions and queries and you can respond and we'll see where it leads us. But some of the questions I've been thinking about and we've been thinking about in preparing for this conversation are, how can the Religious Society of Friends gracefully navigate generational transitions and work to raise up young adult leadership in our communities? Or is raise up even the right term? Maybe nurture or other metaphors for what we are doing with youth, with young adults, and just with leadership in general. What are the opportunities to live into worship and our lives with one another in new ways through transitions? Other questions that come to mind are, what do we mean by leadership in this, if we're talking about leadership? What do we mean by generational transition? Is it just about age, or may there be different ways of thinking about generations in this sense? Maybe we'll start there. What comes to mind today for you, Diane?
Well, I hope you'll comment on a couple of those questions that you posed, because when we met last week to do a little talking about this in advance, Nils, I really appreciated some of your thoughts specifically about that terminology of generational transition and what that looks like. Is it only about age, as well as the question of leadership, because that's certainly a very live topic and has been for a while among Quakers. I think that maybe this is true of all faith communities, but certainly has been for me, particularly when I came to Quakerism, was watching other Quakers and watching how people behaved with one another. And so I think that the kind of way that we are in our meetings, our own monthly meetings, and perhaps in the yearly meeting as well, is a way that we learn our faith and practice. And in many ways, I feel like Quaker faith and practice really lends itself to the idea of, if we're listening very deeply to other human beings, we're listening deeply to other human beings, not just because they're the same age as we are, or because they hold a certain position in the meeting, but because they are people who we are in community with. And so when I've seen that practice well, it is adult to child, child to teenager, teenager to older person. And so I think that when we can see one another as beloved children of God, each of us distinctly, that kind of opens up a space for us to regard one another with a sense of, with the distinct gifts that each person may bring, but with a sense that we all belong. And so, when we think about this notion of engaging different generations in a Quaker meeting, it has to do with how included people are, I think, and how people belong to the meeting community, the organization, how we belong to one another, and how we practice that sense of belonging, to create a beloved community. So to me, that implies that this isn't only about age, although the question of age is very ripe, often because we see some meeting communities where there's an older generation that feels to be carrying a big load, and people can feel kind of tired, like, and they need, they're looking for help. So there's a lot of dimensions to what we're thinking about as we think about that kind of inclusion. Is it inclusion in the spiritual community? Is it inclusion in the full life of the meeting? Is it, a sense of belonging to the is it, well, let me pause there and ask you to comment, Nils, because I feel like you have some experiences both in your work and also as a friend, and thinking about this notion of leadership and how people become leaders, if you will, as Quakers.
Yeah. Well, one thing that comes immediately to mind from what you were just saying was this on the topic of inclusion and what it actually looks like what is the act of including, what is the mechanism that is happening there when someone comes to a new space or comes into a space and ends up feeling included or not, and how much that's a mix of being asked to participate in something, being invited, and I think sometimes it's that, and it feels like, hey, there are things here that we can give. Sometimes it's being asked to engage and participate and share a burden or load with. I don't think there's a simple formula. That the trick, friends, is just ask people to serve on committees more, for example, because I think in every conversation I've had or been a part of about this broad issue, this is one of the canonical, almost archetypical issues that comes up is, do young people come to a meeting and it's, one, that there's a bunch of old people, like the mindset that there's a bunch of experienced friends, shall we say, age experienced friends at a meeting, and there aren't young people. And then when some come and it's new, and then they're sought after like sharks, and they feel swarmed, and they're just asked either patronizing questions or they're engaged in, do you want to serve on a committee too soon? And I think that probably that does happen. But I also just want to acknowledge, for all of these things we're talking about this evening, there are nuances, right? Even the idea of generations having characteristics, and we talk, all the time in the media, there's millennials and Gen Z and the rise of Gen Z, and what do they like? There's not, you can't generalize. You can generalize across generations, but I think holding that loosely, or always bearing in mind that when we generalize, we are inevitably only ending up talking about some of the people with a certain characteristic, is also just good for us to keep in mind. And I wanted to mention that as that's one thing, I will generalize in the course of this conversation, I'm sure, but I'm also trying to hold that in my mind as well.
You know what I think about when I think about, particularly when friends ask me, in a monthly meeting, well, what can we do to get young people to come to our meetings or stay in our meetings? I think about why I came to meeting. I didn't come to the meeting to join a committee. I came to the meeting because I was looking for a place for a spiritual home for myself and kind of a social support for. I was a young mom, and I was looking for a kind of community of people to be connected to. So I feel like it was, that's what a lot of us want in our spiritual homes or in our religious life is a sense of meaning and purpose and connection. And that can be at a social level. It can be at an activist level. It can be, but it can also be in a worshiping kind of situation. So I feel like that's the other way to, I think you spoke to that in the sense of how are we regarding someone who walks through the door of a meeting, or someone who comes, and they've been there 3 times, and, the 4th time they come, someone says, oh, you're new here, and it's like, well, I've really been here. So that whole notion of welcoming and engaging and thinking about, that's work that I think some meetings have really tried to do. And I think it's really important to do that. And so I do think we have to Yeah, I just come back to the notion of like needing to really think through how and why people want to be engaged. What calls us into the wanting to be connected? And, it usually isn't, the first order isn't, I want to go to a meeting for business, or I want to be on a committee. And it may not be for a while that I want to give a message. It may be that I want to be, and it's a place to be. And so that is another way to kind of regard what our meetings need to think about, I think, as we look at the presence of people who don't necessarily conform to the way our own meeting we've expected people to conform to. And I think that's also a really clear indication. And just want to, if I can just use an experience from my work at FCNL, one of the things that we've really thought about as we've expanded our young adult program is how do we reach people who aren't in a Quaker setting? We engage with a lot of people around the country who aren't friends, but who want to engage with us because we're a Quaker organization. And when I got to FCNL in 2011, there were a lot of young people working there already. But after I'd been there for a year or two, I started realizing that sometimes I think Quaker organizations can actually function. I started believing in evangelism, I guess, and thinking like, we have this capacity to attract people to participate with us. And I think Quaker Voluntary Service, I know we have friends here from QVS, it functions in the same way. I think that's happened for you, Nils, a little bit, maybe at Beacon Hill Friends, is that people come, they see something that they're interested, or some people, they some kind of connection. And the question that we've thought a lot about, my colleagues at FCNL and others have thought about, how do we help translate that faith and practice in a way that makes meaning for people without insisting they become a member or a part of a meeting? How do we connect them and make them part of that rich, yeasty mix that we call Quakers?
There's so much richness here in this conversation. I want to go off on from what you've shared. One that comes to mind is in thinking about, I think it's an opportunity. I mean, there are so many ways to, like, what is Quakerism about has as many answers as there are friends, and more, because we could each think of 10 different statements that are true. But the aspect of humility and empathy, or walking humbly over the earth, seeing that of God in every person, I think really can come to bear here, and are things that I try to remind myself of as much as I can. But for example, when thinking about a new person coming into a situation, whether it's a meeting, whether it's their first day on the job at FCNL, whether it's a new resident at the friend's house, how would I want to be welcomed? And when I think back to times that I have come into groups and have felt welcomed and like I belonged or not, what was true about those times? One thing that a mentor of mine taught me in college, I was involved in the student environmental group at my university, and he said, well, Nils, people come, this was called grassroots, and he said, Nils, people come to grassroots because they care about the environment, but that's not why they come back. They come back because they feel like someone else cares that they are there. Mm-hmm. And didn't see them as an interchangeable cog, but as a real person. It's not just, oh, Diane, a warm body, I'm so glad you're here, but I remember you. Diane, so nice to see you again. How did that big meeting go that you had? I remember you mentioned that last time I saw you. How's your dog doing? Whatever. So, and I think we all, on some level, we all know that, but I think it can be hard in practice to remember or to lead with that sentiment when there is fear or concern that, wow, where are all the young people? Oh my gosh, here is one. I don't want to mess this up. I'd better make sure I talk, like we all do silly things. But I think, again, as an opportunity we have as friends is to continually strive to bring contemplation and recentering and bring our best selves to interactions that we have with others. And that's one thing maybe to practice then, is seeing that of God in a person, part of that being seeing them as a truly unique individual and acting like it.
I just have to give a shout out to Gretchen Baker-Smith, because I'll tell you one thing that I saw Gretchen do probably 20 years ago, you know, when they were at Harvard meeting, when kids would arrive, she'd be like, Nils, it's so great to see you. We're so happy you're here, or whatever child appeared. And, you know, who doesn't want to be wanted? Who doesn't want to be attended to? And so I think that's really important for us to think about, not in a way of, we're so happy you're here. What would you like? You know, not the fawning way, but just you're here, you belong. I think that's really important. I want to say something else though about that. I mean, I think this question of like, because I've seen some chatter in some chat in the chatter, chatter in the chat about the notion of age connection. And I will say that we have found at FCNL as an organization, there is a benefit to having, you know, more than one. There's a benefit to having a cohort, you know, in some cases, of people who have something in common, you know, whether that something in common is their passion for immigration reform, you know, or immigration justice, or police justice and policing, or if their passion is that they are in a similar age cohort. And there's no question that there are, you know, events that we do where having a group of people who are in their 20s or somewhere between 19 to, you know, 28, there's a real sense of energy there that's pretty compelling and sticky, if you will, in terms of like people wanting to, you know, come and be together. So I do think, you know, that's something to consider. And I'm not sure how easy that is for an individual meeting to do, but that's another reason why I think the programs that, you know, at least that New England Yearly Meeting has had, where there are opportunities for retreats for people to be together and form that cohesion and that connection with people that are thinking and experiencing some of the same things because of the age that they're going through. It seems important to me. And then the question is kind of how do we, you know, how does that translate for someone, you know, who's in a meeting? And I do know that that's a very live question for many meetings, not just in New England, but around the country, that people are thinking about that.
I think that point about affinity groups is a word that I would use is really huge. And as you said, it's great when that can happen in one place, or to paraphrase, but when sometimes there's not a cohort of folks under age 30, friends of color, friends of LGBTQIA flavor, any other, even interest, as you said, you know, there may be no one else in your meeting with a passion for immigration justice, and that can be lonely. So the value of having and connecting with broader groups that tie together, even if your meeting's amazing, even if for someone coming into a meeting, even if it seems like it might be amazing, but are there others that share my X or Y or Z aspect of my identity that's really important to me? Being able to connect with larger networks, I think, can sustain that feeling of belonging at the local level as well.
You know, this question of one of the things that, you know, if we didn't know this before the pandemic, we now know it, that we can convene in lots of different ways. We don't have to all be in the same, you know, benches in the same meeting house to form community. I personally have an affinity for being in a meeting house with people. I'd rather be in a human closeness situation than the distance, but there is, you know, that is a reality. And so, you know, that, and there are any number of, you know, platforms that people are making connection around, you know, in terms of Quakerism, in terms of, you know, Quaker theology or Quaker practice, or, you know, or I'm a Quaker and I'm connecting spiritually with other folks too. And so I think that's also a way that, you know, the technology of how we connect with one another has certainly been required during the pandemic. And I think it's going to continue being a real issue as we look forward. And so I think the sort of, you know, I mean, when I think about the last couple of years in particular, you know, the racial reckoning that, you know, the country has gone through, that I'm seeing meetings go through, that you know, our organization is coping with, you know, and is real, you know, but the reckoning around how society is ordering itself is also changing. I mean, clearly we think a lot about that in terms of political divide. I mean, I know everybody does that. It affects FCNL's work a lot, but this, maybe people feel like we've gone through these kinds of, dramatic changes before, but I feel like there is some real change happening. And, when I think about, the what I call leadership on activism coming from young people, I mean, certainly Greta Thunberg is a person whose name is mentioned all the time. And right now, as we were at COP26, we may think about that. But, there are tens of thousands, if not millions of young people in particular, around climate change, climate justice, environmental justice, but also like preventing gun violence. I mean, look at the leadership that has emerged, around, that it just, so I guess the thing that I'm in awe about is that is not, there's a kind of energy there that is formidable that, I think is really important to think about how do we channel that, and not how do we channel, I don't mean that, how is that energy channeled in a way that connects it to a broader movement? So to me, those are pretty kind of really interesting questions. They relate to our Quakerism. They're not the same as, I want to be clear, but they clearly relate.
Yeah. That point about, or that aspect of leadership and what do we mean by leadership is definitely something I wanted to touch on. That, I mean, I think as friends, we have a different approach to leadership and decision making. That's one of the hallmarks of one of the things that a lot of people know about Quakers too, or certainly if they attend a unprogrammed worship, who's at the front? Oh, there's no one at the front, or maybe there's a bench. That's different. But I think it runs much deeper than that, obviously. I heard someone say once, and if this is a known quote, I'm sorry, I forget the attribution, but that Quakers didn't abolish the clergy, they abolished the laity. In other words, we're all ministers in a sense, right? Or at least anyone has gifts of ministry available to them and can, that is open to them. Which also relates to when we think about leadership and lifting up leadership, I might add also lifting up ministry, lifting up prophetic voices. Again, with the humility, are we sure we know what we're looking for? Do we know what it looks like? And I think sometimes, yes, or there are some forms that are easy. Everyone would say, wow, that's leadership happening. Wow, oh my gosh, that person has such great gifts of ministry. And there are sometimes that it's not, or sometimes where it doesn't look like even our subconscious expectations of what it will look like. And I also kind of want to call out explicitly even like myself in this, right? In some ways, so I'm now in what Emily Province calls the second thirds. I'm 38 years old, no longer a young adult friend by many definitions, but I started my role at the friend's house in the later years of my yaffdom as a yaff. And I kind of feel like though that's, so look, here I am, a product of the New England Yearly Meeting youth programs and running a Quaker institution in New England. We can all pat ourselves on the back. Not to say that I'm not grateful and proud and joyous about that, but this should not be the only path or way that Quaker leadership, what it looks like. This is sort of the easy, like, yeah, obviously that's, and not obviously it's going to happen, but if we're only looking for people who grew up attending youth programs and now we can pick them to put in leadership positions, I think we're doing it wrong.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I mean, we have to put up a little bit. I mean, so I want to just say a word or two about, what at FCNL in terms of how, so before I got to FCNL in 2011, FCNL had this futures working group about like, how do we envision the future? And not surprisingly, it involved, we need to do something to, attract more youth to be involved with FCNL. They'd had an internship program that had been started back in the 70s. So there are people of my age who identify as FCNL interns, still, which is always amuses me, but they hadn't changed a lot. And so we decided we're going to do a capital campaign. So we made, having youth programs expand as the centerpiece of that without really knowing exactly what it would look like. And it was actually one of the young adults who helped us really imagine this new concept of an advocacy corps, which was engaging people, sort of hiring them. When I say hiring, they aren't full-time staff, but we pay them a stipend to organize in their community on a particular issue. So this year, it's a cohort of about 18 people. This year, the issue is environmental justice, and so they come together, they learn about the issue, they're trained to do advocacy, and they learn a little bit about Quakerism. And a handful are Quaker or identify as Quaker, but many aren't, and we really we were very intentional about we have been very intentional about doing outreach in communities of color and in places that aren't four-year liberal arts schools, and really looking to have some openness to, do you have to be in college to do this? No, you could be working part-time. I mean, it's really kind of be intentional about the other than European American Quakers who might, have that heritage. And it has been really dynamic for us. And not just for us as FCNL, but dynamic for the people who are involved, and who really see what they can learn in the program, but also see how it cultivates their way of thinking about connecting with people who aren't exactly like them, whether it's geographically or theologically or by ethnicity. And that's exciting, because ultimately, we care a lot about getting people to talk to members of Congress. That's what we really focus on a whole range of issues. But we also care about the experience people have when they make this connection, because, I personally believe this, and I think many people who are involved with FCNL or who involved with whatever activism they do, we're called from a place of spirit to do this work, to change the world, or to try to affect the world. So whatever that is, whether it's through this organization, through some other work, and honoring that and recognizing that call, you don't have to be a Quaker to have that call. You don't have to have that, people have inward leadings, whether they identify as religious or whether they identify as Catholic or Jewish or whatever. So anyway, that to me is also pretty fascinating to think about what is the role of a Quaker organization or the role of the Religious Society of Friends in celebrating that, rejoicing in it, and thinking about how are we part of that rich calling.
I find that question of, to put it another way, what is the relevance of the Religious Society of Friends to folks outside of the Religious Society of Friends really fascinating. And I think you just spoke some to this, but in thinking about this event ahead of time, I'm curious to explore that more of the relevance of that question to this topic of raising up leadership, of generational transition. And I think you spoke to it in a Quaker organizational or institutional context, and this is very true at the Beacon Hill Friends House as well, where most of our residents are not Quaker, and that's always been the case. We're intentional about both our residency program and our online public programs, which we had 1,100 people join last year. In case you haven't tuned in, it was a little plug for that. We've rapidly grown that in the past few years. Most are not Quaker, or at least many folks, and we're being intentional about trying to both serve those who want to go deeper and who are experienced with friends, but also be approachable and accessible. I think the issues are slightly different, or the context is certainly different for a meeting, but I think some of this also applies. And I know when we were speaking last week, the metaphor that came to me is, if the Society of Friends is a garden, there's some new growth growing from inside the garden, and some, I haven't fully thought through this metaphor, but some plants coming from outside or growth coming from outside, and the garden expands. But when we think about transition and turning over, how much, if we're measuring just is the exact same plot of land growing what it was growing and what I remember it growing, I think we'll have a different assessment than what is the broader result of our care and our stewardship, our ministry, and our tending. And are there seeds like the many Quaker youth I grew up with and then had the pleasure to staff through youth programs who don't attend meeting anymore? Are they, and maybe they're a member, maybe they're not, but there's still some Quakerism there. And I don't know if, I think membership is important. That's a whole separate discussion we could have, and that would be really rich, I'm sure, too. The role of membership and importance, how it has changed for a young adult context in the modern age or not. But just thinking broadly and expansively, again, maybe that's easier to do from a Quaker institutional context, but I'd be interested to hear, as someone who not just works for a Quaker institution, but has been part of meetings for a long time too, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I wondered about this for a long time. I mean, even, just why, because there are a lot of people who I think consider themselves, people who grew up in Quaker meetings who consider themselves culturally Quaker, is what I would call it, that they're in many ways, their behavior, their kind of instincts, their, would be grounded in what would be many practices, but they don't necessarily want to participate. And I think sometimes it is, there's an impatience, honestly. I mean, I've heard this from people I'm close to, that there's a sense of being impatient about what's happening in a meeting that feels not right for them. And so I think that's a question, is how do we have grace even with one another, in our situations of worship? Because I think, anyways, I think that's an issue. But I want to go back to this question of leadership in Quaker organizations, because I saw a couple questions or comments in the chat about that. I mean, Nils, when you took this job with Beacon Hill, we talked. I remember talking to you about this and your decision making. Because you were doing pretty interesting work here in Washington, D.C. and had lots of options, and you still have many options of where you want to go. And I think I'm not sure how many people. I certainly didn't, think when I took the job at FCNL, I had not had the ambition that I wanted to be a leader in a Quaker organization. That was not a thought that had occurred to me, honestly, until the position came open and it aligned with some of my own background. And it felt rightly led. It felt like, yeah, this is a place where I want to be. And it felt like ministry. And so, but I firmly believe that there's a lot of Quaker leadership that isn't directly named as being part of the Religious Society of Friends, but shows up in the way people are teachers, or the way people are parents, or the way people are, writers, or whatever it is they do. I feel like, that their formation shows up in that. So I think that's really important to kind of regard that and honor that, because there's something about, I want to just touch on this question of being a good enough Quaker, because I think there's something about like the wholesomeness of how our spiritual life affects every aspect of who we are, that we somehow think that we have to work or be that kind of Quaker person all the time. But really, I feel like if we're part of like, the intentionality of allowing God's presence in our lives, that doesn't just happen. Our belief system is that doesn't just happen on Sundays. It happens, it happens all the time. So I don't know, I feel like I'm wandering a little bit from where we went, but I feel like this question of sort of how leadership affects who we are and how we have an opportunity to practice it certainly can happen in lots of Quaker settings, paid or not, but it certainly doesn't have to happen only in Quaker organizations.
Yeah, that resonates a lot with me. And one thing that we talked about at the Friends House, my colleagues and I think it was right in the few months before the pandemic, in thinking about that I've sort of been carrying through, but it involved an in-person event idea. So that hasn't happened yet. But New England Yearly Meeting had a series of great living faith gatherings. And the topic came up, this this question of what does it mean to be a Quaker, not just in all aspects of life, but in work specifically. And yes, it's one thing to work for a Quaker institution, and that's a whole separate discussion that is valuable to have of how do we orient and explain and teach Quakerism to those coming in without that background. But on the flip side, what does it mean to be a Quaker in your work as a teacher? How does that show up? What does it mean to be a Quaker as a doctor? Are there ways that we express our faith and live our faith through our vocations, through our professions, through just our jobs? So this idea was, could we have a working faith gathering in addition to the living faith gathering? And I think I mentioned it once to maybe to Nia, and then a pandemic happened. But Nia, we should talk about that if that's interesting, or if anyone else wants to help me plan that sometime. I want to come back, Diane, to something that you started to speak earlier to your work with youth at FCNL, and that's been a big priority for the organization, and I know for you specifically as well, in your time there. And I'm curious how your understandings of change making and of privilege have shifted or been shaped by your experience of working with young adults, with young leaders, because we are all leaders, in your time at FCNL, and in particular this topic of what sometimes we might talk about as walking the walk comes up, I think, in working with younger folks, that you spoke to an impatience sometimes seen among youth, which I think is not new to the current time, right? That like youth are impatient, older folks are maybe more patient, whether from wisdom or otherwise. I don't know. There's lots of different angles on that, but I've definitely heard that critique many times, especially from YAFs, I think, over time, that my meeting says it believes in these things, but it doesn't act with integrity on those beliefs, or we want to do something, but it's just talk, we're not taking action. So curious about your thoughts on that, the generational aspects of that walking the walk, and of, I guess part of that is speed, but that's not the only part.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say, I mean, so I feel like I have a privilege of working with a lot of people who model for one another, you know, at FCNL. I mean, there are people who come in at age, 23 to work with us for a year as program assistants. And they have people who are, 2 years older than they are, who are modeling for them and kind of, being connectors. And so that feels like a privileged place to be, to have that kind of breadth of experience there. I think in terms of privilege of, economic privilege, racial privilege, white privilege, I feel like I have, or even Quaker privilege, honestly. I mean, being in an organization that has people who don't identify with a religion, we identify as a Quaker organization. And so being a Quaker, gives me a kind of like privilege, if you will, I suppose. And so I think trying to see that and understand how it may affect I feel like I'm definitely learning about how that has an impact on other people. But I also think about like what we, I guess I want to just refer for a minute to, there's some really rich text in the chat, and I hate to take you away from the conversation we're having, but I just want to say that there are ways that I've seen people who may have resonated with me, but not uniformly. Do you know what I mean? I guess that's the thing I want to say, is that I want to just remark that Diane Butterfield talked about becoming a friend and being kind of called into, Quakerism by older friends. And I would say that has been an experience I've had too, not necessarily because of age, but when I was a young Quaker, meaning new to my spiritual formation, having experienced friends, people who had been friends and who had been practiced, who would observe something, maybe about ministry or, that I was offering, or some gift that I had. So I think that's a role that those of us who have certain experience can do that for one another. And I don't even think that takes that much, but to notice, and to name what people are bringing into the spiritual gifts, but also the social and organizing gifts. I mean, I happen to think that extroverts are a gift to the religious society friends because there aren't that many of them. So we should honor that and be grateful for them. But I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious, but I feel like there are many, many gifts that we can, if we can see the benefit of those gifts and have some grace about how we regard them. I remember a few years ago being in meeting for worship and hearing a message during ministry, during silent worship. And afterwards, I mean, we're literally thinking, man, that was a dumb message. Why would that person say that? And someone came up to me, a friend who I regarded quite highly, came up to me afterwards and said, oh my gosh, that was such an amazing message. I felt so ministered to. And that was a lesson for me, that what I regard as a particular form of ministry or what I see may not be what somebody else is experiencing. And so sometimes I need to get out of the way. And I just want to say those words because as we prepared for this tonight, it was like, well, what's one thing that we need to think about in this time of grace and transition? Sometimes it is getting out of the way for older friends or standing aside. Not in the sense of standing aside because I have a difference with you, but standing aside because someone else can step forward. And maybe that's also something I've learned about privilege is that sometimes silence or waiting or standing aside is called for.
This reminds me also that of the importance of the narrative. Your story reminds me of that. As much as I like to think of myself as an independent thinker, I've become very aware of how much, not just whatever the flavor that happens to be going on in my own head on a particular day is, but the way that others' assumptions seep into me, the way that the broader culture seeps in and affects my thinking on things. And if I enter a situation thinking, oh gosh, we're not doing well enough at the friend's house in X. And so these new residents are going to come in and they're going to be so critical of what we're doing. And if I then show up that way, that may color the experience of those people. Or if not that I shouldn't listen and pay attention to reality and what I'm being presented with, but checking my own assumptions at each turn, I think is also helpful. And just a brief story of that. I think my mindset, my assumption had been that, oh yeah, Quaker meetings, there's not a lot of young people. And that's true at Beacon Hill meeting. Here I am, fairly new in my role, Beacon Hill Friends House. And the meeting in the house is just so that I think folks may know, but they're separate entities. So the house is a separate nonprofit institution and the meeting has worshiped in the space for half a century at least. But so that was my mindset. I think I wasn't fully aware of it. And then I realized one time, so I went to meeting, and afterwards, some of the other YAFs and youngish folks were going to go walk to lunch in Chinatown, a tradition that sometimes happens. And so Adam Corman said, hey, Nils, do you want to come? Others are going. I said, oh, yeah, great, cool. And we're walking to lunch. And there had been, 35 friends or so at meeting that day. And there were 12 YAFs, but I knew for a fact two YAFs I had talked to had left. And I thought, wait a minute, this is not few people. This is like half the room who was at worship. But I think it took that explicit moment of noticing, separating out and bothering and happening to count to realize that the narrative I had did not actually live up to reality or did not match reality any longer. I'm conscious of the time and I want to make sure we have time for questions.
If maybe Bobby from FCNL could put, and I don't know whether you have any, I'd love to have, because there's a question in the chat about opportunities for young adults, and because we are constantly trying to promote these opportunities and we do have some financial support available, if we could put in the programs that we have for year-long programs, summer internships, and this advocacy corps, as well as for the spring lobby weekend that we do. And I do know we have QVS people here too. And if people aren't familiar with QVS, I invite that and also Beacon Hill Friends. I mean, go to the websites and look at these organizations, because increasingly, there are many different organizations that are trying to provide the kinds of programs and experience, provides programs that allow people to have experiences that, not only with other Quakers, but with other people who share some element of concern for, some cases concern for particular issues, but also concern for making meaning in life. So.
And I think that speaks to the affinity group aspect that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
So there are just two other topics I wanted to touch briefly on, and then maybe I think Nia is going to pull out some questions from the chat. I've just been watching it go by, but haven't been able to digest those. So thank you in advance, Nia. But Diane, thinking ahead, just so we're not, some of these topics are heavy, as Nia said, they are tender. What excites you as you now and as you think to the future about the Society of Friends, civic engagement, young adult leadership, including from your experience with FCNL, but otherwise as well?
Well, I'm excited about, I'm glad we're having this conversation, but I think that this conversation is alive among, lots of meetings, lots of organizations, but also the conversation about our own whiteness as kind of liberal North American Quakers. I mean, clearly we know that we are not the majority of Quakers in the world. And but I also feel like that I shouldn't say, but I feel like there's an interesting dialogue going on about our own whiteness and how do we look at that and how does that invite generational change. And so that to me is exciting, and I don't think it's an immediate, I think over time, change will happen, in the Religious Society of Friends. What I love about being a Quaker and working with Quakers is the kind of what intensity and willingness to stay with something, that we have. We can be very dogged once we decide we're going to do something, which can also be a fall. But I think that's exciting to see what's happening. So I'm grateful that there are people who follow their leadings, and by following their leadings, develop leadership.
Right on.
You, Nils.
I'm excited that that we're having this conversation, and others are as well. I'm excited by, I think innovation happens in small pockets often, right? And sometimes it's only seen by its light is only shines in a small circle, and sometimes the flame grows and it casts a broader light. And I think there are, even just the pandemic and all the adapting we've had to do to Zoom has prompted a lot of innovations for folks, friends connecting across distance. I know Beacon Hill meeting, and I know lots of others have had, it's enabled intervisitation on a scale never before possible, and with much less climate impact, I might add. I'm excited about, just another example to mention in that realm is, as far as I guess, slightly new forms that are emerging too, or experiments really, in Quakerism, adjacent to Quakerism, involving Quakerism. Here in Massachusetts, Three Rivers Meeting is a new form that's a number of friends from Boston area meetings and otherwise have created an online only Quaker worship and experiential space. A lot of their gatherings are Thursday mornings. That's not what we do as friends, right? But and yet it is. So and even at I'm proud too of the work that we've been doing at the Friends House, and that my colleague Jen Higgins Newman has been incredibly ably leading and developing and creating for us, as far as new forms of programming that, again, we're not a meeting, but I don't know, feels less, there's a better term than Quaker flavored. But again, opportunities to explore and to dabble. It's the buffet of Quaker faith and thought and practice. Please come sample and enjoy. And even being aware of the language that we use there and how what is inclusive and welcoming to one person might be off-putting to another. And if we're really striving to see that of God in everyone, maybe sometimes that even needs to, or that means we need to use other language than seeing that of God. Just as one example. But so I'm excited by innovation, by creativity, and by people taking chances and exploring, because we don't lose anything by trying out new things like this, you know? Three Rivers meeting, existing, the Beacon Hill Friends House holding a Wednesday night midweek worship or non-worship, like this in no way threatens the existing structures and forms that we have in the Religious Society of Friends. So I'm excited by that.
Just underscore intervisitation, sort of what's been afforded through the pandemic and the virtual world. I think it has been really rich. We've seen that at our Wednesday afternoon silent reflection time, that there are people who've come to that and become a community who aren't connected to a Quaker community anywhere, but they've become part of this Quaker community, and it's very powerful for them. And so anyone can come, 5:15 on Wednesdays.
Great. Well, yes, Nia, if maybe think about what first question you have. There's one I thought of, Diane. I'll ask you a question, Diane, and you can say whether you'd rather go to Nia for a question, or if you already covered this, or we didn't use the word hope all that much, but I wanted to touch on that too. I think that relates to excitement, but it's slightly different. This has been a hard year and a half for almost everyone, I think. And a lot of change, and change itself, even when there are beneficial aspects, is hard and has a cognitive load and emotional load, and I think spiritual aspects of that as well for us. So how have you sustained your hope? If you have, you don't have to say that you have. If you haven't, we can be truthful here. But any reflections on hope as you think about in a context of friends here, and as we move forward?
Yes, Nia, do you want to? We're kind of at the end of time, yeah.
We've got time, but the question that I was going to ask is really related to Nils's. So I wonder if I might throw it out there, and you can respond to both together, maybe. But I'm seeing from the questions that we received, a lot of friends who are having a challenging time, and watching generational transition unfold, and are feeling some fear or some disappointment. Some friend mentioned bitterness and grief. And so what, related to that hope, what's encouragement that you might offer friends standing in that place?
It has been it's been a hard 5.5 years from my perspective. And it sometimes feels in the particular work that we do at FCNL, but I think this is true for a lot of people. There's a lot of brokenness, and I feel like I've in some ways I feel like I've seen that more in recent years than I had for some time. But I go back to what I said earlier about the intentionality of people that I see as part of the Quaker community. And I'm going to define that broadly. I don't mean an individual meeting. I don't mean an individual organization. What I mean is that there is a spirit of commitment, a spirit of deep listening, a spirit that seeks to move in love. It's not only among Quakers, but I see it, and I see it alive and well, and longing for nurturing. And, there are times that each of us feel despair and anger and fatigue. And that is the blessing of pastoral care among us, that someone else may recognize that and support us or encourage us to step out. So I love, the idea of being tender with one another and trying to hold one another up, but also knowing when we have to step back. And sometimes that stepping back may be because of some frailty that we're experiencing, whether that's emotional or age or a different calling. But I think that ability to care for one another and intention to try to do that on a regular and consistent basis, to me is really the most hopeful thing. What about you, Nils?
You used the word brokenness, which is really sinking deep for me and bringing up a lot of thoughts in that I've noticed over time, over the past, I don't know, I keep on reflecting on all the time, right? And it's like, is that a recent thing? Have I been reflecting on this for 10 years? But it feels like in my adulthood at some point, I think my mindset about the world used to be, as someone who grew up in a rather academically focused setting, definitely steeped in white culture and various aspects of that and definitions and what that means. But I grew up with the subconscious idea and assumption that good meant getting 100% on the test and perfect and non-broken systems, and anything less than that is an aberration and is bad. And I think my views are more nuanced and subtle on that now, but I think I've gotten used to, and this may seem, I'm sorry if this seems dark at all, I don't mean it that way, and it doesn't feel dark to me, but just that some amount of brokenness is actually the natural order of things. And whether you're thinking of, I don't know, in a large enough organization, there's always some job role that is unfilled at any point in time. There's always turnover happening somewhere. There's always a committee position that is vacant. And in other aspects, I mean, these seem trivial. They're just the silly ones that come to mind sometimes, come first. But my grandfather was a dentist. This relates, I promise. And so I grew up with a dental culture, and yet I've had like more fillings than I can count in my mouth, friends. And I've had dentists say, like, did you grow up without fluoridated water? Do you drink a lot of soda? Neither of those are the case. One dentist described my teeth as chalky. I don't know. I just don't have great teeth. But I realized at some point that the goal is not maintaining all of my adult tooth enamel until the day I die. That I just need functional teeth over time. Again, this is a silly example, but if you get to know me more, you'll sometimes this is how my brain works. And so it's kind of just like a glide path that it's a little bit broken. I had a root canal a month ago. Okay, that's not ideal. Hopefully that doesn't happen all at once. It's broken, and yet we move on. And I think that actually that's part of the human condition, is living with brokenness. And in fact, and maybe it's worth, like, it's a big element of white culture, the idea that perfection is possible and that we should be perfect and that there's one ideal of what that is. And so getting used to things being a little bit broken and still being okay, or getting used to things not being totally okay and yet still we persist, life moves on, and we figure out a way through, and we do that together and in community as much as we can, and with tenderness as much as we can, and with love as much as we can. I think maybe that's part of the Quaker way too, or what it should be. And I think that's very relevant here, that it will be the case that some meetings get smaller, and that's not sad, right? It will be the case that things aren't like they used to, and that some beautiful things that used to be will go away. So I think some of my approach to change making, to life is that like sometimes the answer is just, yeah, it sucks, and something else follows it. Yeah.
Well, I'm so grateful to all the people that are here that are contributing in the chat. There is a world of conversation going on, and I'm grateful for it. I'm going to try to combine a few questions that I think speak to a similar theme that I think are asking basically, how do we get better at noticing gifts of leadership in a broader and wider group of people? What does nurturing leadership and preparing leaders to serve as leaders look like, and has it looked like for you? And related to that is, as we think about a future of Quakerism where a lot of the people in Quaker spaces, in Quaker communities weren't raised Quaker, what does it look like to provide apprenticeship to the faith and practice of Quakerism to new people, new to us people?
Well, I'll start. I love the term apprenticeship. I think it's a wonderful teaching, connecting, observing, noticing kind of role to have, and there's an obligation back from the person who is the apprentice as well, to allow practice to happen as well as teaching. And so I think that's a wonderful word. You know, I think, you know, we talked earlier about how sometimes people, we use the term younger people, but it could really be anyone kind of coming into a meeting, you know, who shows interest, talent, capacity, might feel, you know, rushed to be asked to take on some role. And, you know, that's not always bad. I mean, sometimes a person may be ready to take on a role. And so, but sometimes it's also just listening for when the no comes, and then coming back and not taking it as rejection, you know. I mean, it kind of ties in with what Nils said earlier about allowing brokenness, or, you know, recognizing that that's going to happen. I think that, you know, really thinking a lot about affirmation and appreciation for when people take a step, or whatever it may be. You know, maybe it's not taking on a role of what we might think of as traditional leadership in the meeting, but maybe it is taking an action and just noticing and saying to someone, I saw that you know, did that, and I just want to thank you for it, and I'm impressed by that. It's, you know, or I'm grateful for it, or I see that you know, have a way of talking to people about a particular issue, or whatever it might be. So I think that that's certainly a role, and I think that there are people. I don't know that all people in the who are older in the meeting see that as their role, and I'm not sure that it is the role of people just because they're older. I think it's a role that we can play with one another, you know, in terms of appreciating and noticing. I will tell you that my experience has been that when someone who is considered to be a weighty friend, and I know that that's a loaded term, but someone who has long served in many capacities in a meeting, observes something that does feel like it has kind of an impact. Personally, it just had an impact on me, you know, and so it not an impact that it made me behave differently. It made me think about myself a little bit differently. And so I think that's the question, is that part of leadership is how do we find ourselves in that and experiencing it. And if someone affirms that what's happening, that's very motivating. And so I think about that in regard to the practice.
I very much agree with this aspect of the importance of affirmation and appreciation. And two things come to mind for me additionally. One is the, I guess you could call it whatever the opposite of a one-size-fits-all approach is. But as you were saying, that for some folks, it might be the right step to jump in right away. And some folks the opposite, but really paying attention to the individual. And yes, having plans and sort of scripts in our head, but this is something we definitely try to do at the Friends House as new residents move in, and we have committees at the house level, and we have expectations that folks will be involved. And some it's, you know, at the end of their first week and they're saying like, hey, can I join building and grounds? And some it's the opposite of that, and that's totally okay. And if we, I think sometimes there's a role for rigidness, and structure is definitely important and helpful in these settings, and it can provide feelings of security and all that, but flexibility is at least as important. And we have the ability, I think, whether we're a Quaker organization or a Quaker community, to really speak to individuals and respond to the individual, not to, oh, you're a person in a spot and that's what I have a need for on nominating committee or whatever. The other thing is, maybe it relates to what you were saying earlier, Diane, about getting out of the way, but I've been, part of my leadership journey over the past year or two has been trying to become more aware of the ways in which I inadvertently do things that counter my efforts to be welcoming or to be to bring people in. And that might be because I care really strongly about the outcome, and I send an email to the committee, and as the executive director, my voice has a lot of weight, and so I'm just trying to dash off something quickly, and it's then perceived as whoa. And so I'm not sure how to sum that up super concisely, or what the button point there is, but just being aware of the ways that I, as an individual, and so this is, I think, a topic for each of us, how are we being our best selves, and how do we, without knowing it, sometimes show up in ways that counteract the values that we want to be lifting up, which I think speaks to cultivating relationships with folks who will elder you, who will speak truth to your power, and who will gently pull you aside and say, Nils, I love you, but I want to talk to you about a thing I noticed.
Well, I'll just share quickly. When I was asked to become clerk of my meeting in Hartford back in, probably, I don't know how many, 25 years ago or more, the person who asked me, who was the clerk of the nominating committee at the time, said to me, well, Diane, some people find that prayer really helps. He was right.
Well, maybe related to that advice, again, I'm going to do my best to try to smush together a few questions as sort of a final part of this question and response type. I'm seeing a comment in the chat, a noticing about how big and somewhat overwhelming a lot of leadership roles can be right now for people, and how there's sometimes these kind of contrasting demands of trying to maintain institutions or communities as they exist right now, and also to embrace change. I saw a comment a long while back about how we have the opportunity to welcome enthusiasm and channel. I heard you talk, Diane, about being a, channeling energy, and I'm wondering what a commitment to truly welcoming enthusiasm and truly seeing our role or a leader's role as channeling and embracing energy that comes its way, what that looks like in practice, or what that looks like in your practice.
Do you want to start, Nils?
I'm still digesting the question. I guess one thing, getting increasingly stuffed up here, but sorry. On the aspect of, or right sizing of leadership commitments, I think, and again, back to the flexibility of questioning our assumptions and our expectations of the way things have to be. Maybe there's a little bit of, I don't like to think of things in a, well, when push comes to shove way, but I think sometimes that can be useful of, like, I know there have been times in my life, I mean, I became a father 19 months ago and was trying to steward an organization in a pandemic, and really grateful to have amazing colleagues, and it's a rather cooperative organization and there are lots of people involved, but there were definitely times where I felt, wow, I just cannot deal with all the things that I'm handling, and some things need to drop. What are the things? I think that's true when we're talking about tasks or projects, but also in the sense of what is most important with the way that I think my organization should be, or equally we could talk about a meeting. And is it that we have to have staff meeting on Wednesday afternoons because that's when we've told people we're having it, or we have to have house meeting on Sunday nights, or we have to have house dinner at 6:30 p.m. sharp because that's the way we've done it, and that's what's deeply ingrained in my brain, and I've told people that, and I would have to tell them otherwise? Or are there things that can shift? And I know that there have been conversations in New England Yearly Meeting over the past few years about, and I think I saw a comment in the chat about this, about the size of the role of clerk in particular, but of the other leadership positions, which demand take huge amounts of time, not just as in that's an obligation, but we would hope that someone would be able to spend large amounts of time into this work should they have that availability, but that how much that limits the possible pool of people who can possibly commit to take on a role that is basically like a half-time unpaid job with a lot of stakeholders asking a lot of you at all points in time. And if that basically means you have to be either retired and or supported by a spouse or partner financially and or independently wealthy, and have a car and be able to get around to committee meetings, there are lots of things like that I was really glad to see the yearly meeting consider. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago at sessions. This has come up at the Friends House as well recently as far as our board commitments and thinking about different ways to engage volunteers and right size the roles. And it also has come up in, again, this is less relevant for, maybe it's less relevant for meetings, but the question of paying people, which I have heard more times than I can count the phrase, Quakers don't have ministers, but we're also all ministers, or we don't pay people for, or I don't know. I think there are various ideas that I don't actually know the source of any of those, but I know that enough to know sometimes it's fraught, that question of paying people for things. And it is fraught when you have some folks volunteering and some folks getting paid. That is a really, proceed cautiously. That's true at an organizational setting too, at a nonprofit where there are paid staff and there are volunteers, and well, they're getting paid to do this work, why shouldn't I? That kind of thinking can happen if you step in the wrong place. But at the Friends House, we made the decision for our public programs, for example, we offer honoraria to our speakers. So yeah, we could run events and get a lot of the speakers to just volunteer their time. We're a volunteer-run organization, many aspects of us as fueled by volunteers, and certainly meetings. Most of us in New England, at least, it's unprogrammed meetings. There's not a paid pastor or minister, but that also then limits who has who's financially able to step up and serve. So that's a small decision that we made, but hopefully it has expanded our pool of possible facilitators and speakers. Diane, over to you. I talked for a lot there.
No, that was really good, Nils. I mean, I think you raised the kinds of questions that I think for people who really want to spend their time doing work that traditionally doesn't pay, but they have gifts in that area. I mean, these are really valid questions we should be thinking about and considering, and or people who bring a life experience. I mean, we were called out on that, by asking someone to come in and speak to our policy committee And, the answer was like, well, look, you're asking someone to come in from lived experience, and you're not valuing that. And so I think that these are kinds of questions that kind of are questions we have to confront from a place of privilege. I'll just say personally that I also recognize, that there are just to the point of like what I can do and can't do. I mean, there are things I don't do well, I don't like in meetings. I'm not a person who does icebreakers well, don't ask me to do that role. I mean, that's kind of a silly little one, but that's a gift that someone brings, is to connect people or to close, in a sense of bringing people together in a spiritual grounding. And, or there's, there's all kinds of gifts that people can offer. And I think valuing those, and then also understanding that the people who seem to be in the front, so to speak, valuing the people who are not in the front is really important, because generally we can't make those things happen unless someone is out raising the money or doing the books or cleaning the kitchen or whatever it is to do. So I think that's, the body of Christ kind of concept of that, there's a value for every person. I think that's really valuable. And then I think also, I just need to say that there's we are not indispensable. A lot of people have heard me tell this story, but I love this story because some people know Tom Ewell, who was in New England Yearly Meeting for a period of time. He's now out in North Pacific Yearly Meeting, but Tom was on our field committee. And when I started FCNL, and I came to an executive committee 2 weeks before I started and was in the office, and a lot of people didn't know me very well. And Tom came up to me and he said, "Diane, we are so glad you're here. It's just wonderful to have you. We know you're going to do a great job as the executive secretary of FCNL. But this is really not about you. It's really about the whole of the community that makes up, this organization. It's about Quakers across the country." And he said it with a smile, and he was absolutely right. And, that's something that we need to think about, not just whether we're like in a named position in an organization, but whatever role we may be filling, in our organizations, that sometimes stepping aside and seeing that we may not necessarily see who's going to come and take that position or do that job, but we may need to allow ourselves to step out of it, or thinking that we're so the center of it.
I remember participating in a community organizing training in college once by Wellstone Action, which is now called Repower, a great training organization. And the number one takeaway it said was, the number one rule of organizing is, it's not about you. And that is really, I hope that has stuck with me since. I think it has, and I'm sure there are innumerable ways in which it is not, and my ego has gotten the best of me all over the place. But I think that's just huge. The one other thing I want to briefly say was what you were saying, Diane, reminded me of in thinking about the issue of paid work or not. I remember learning that, or being told that, at least part of the origin of membership in the Religious Society of Friends was so that you knew who was a Quaker and who was not, so that when a person got arrested for their ministry or for doing something that the powers that be didn't like, you knew that, the whomevers are part of our community. We better go and check on their kids. We better make sure that they're taken care of. And I don't know whether this is a function of Quakers used to be more separate from society and now we're more enmeshed, whether just society is way more complex and globalized and interconnected now. But I know very few, I know a lot of Quakers. I know very few that I know of who are supported financially by their meetings. That said, released to ministry, and we're going to cover your rent. And maybe that probably happens more than I know of, but it's certainly not the norm in my experience. That, hey, you have a gift, you have something that needs lifting up. We're really in such tight covenant community that we're taking care of each other. How are we doing that? Does your child's tuition need paying? Do your daycare? Like, that's a scary concept, Sam. And I think that for me, even just being part of a community, were that to come up, I would have the scarcity clutch feelings right away. But there couldn't possibly be enough. What if we did that for everyone? There wouldn't be enough to go around. But I think trying to push through that initial reaction, at least for myself. I won't speak for anyone else here or project, but you know, what if there were enough, or what if there's not, and yet we still tried to do some more of that anyway?
Yeah, and I just want to throw this word out that Nia raised when we were talking last week, was the word of trust. Because to me, that we're talking about, do we trust our community? Do we trust one another? Do we trust God?
I think that's a really beautiful note to end on as the clock strikes 8:30.